Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Harbor Online Community Podcast, YouTube, whatever you want to call it, where we talk about our Thursday night gatherings and what happened. So, Jon, you led some content last night, and I would love to hear what was it about. We are in our fourth week of our Faith in the Wilderness series, and yeah, what did you talk about last night?
Thanks, Dottie. Good to be here with you today. So we took a little bit of a turn. For those who have been following along, our first 3 weeks in this Lent Wilderness series have really focused on the biblical character of Hagar, and all of that has been through a lens of womanist theology, and I think it's been great. I think we've all been learning a lot. Wilderness, though, is a big theme throughout the whole Bible, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, and we did want to like expand and see some more characters and some more wilderness. So this last meeting we talked about John the Baptist, and John is associated with the wilderness largely because he's out there preaching and baptizing people and wearing weird clothes and eating weird food. He's like a very eccentric wilderness figure. The story that we looked at, though, physically did not take place in the wilderness. So he had been out in the wilderness for a long time doing ministry, but then he got arrested. He was speaking up against some unethical practices in the royal family, and he was imprisoned. And so instead, this passage, which we looked at, there's a couple versions of it. We looked at mostly at the one from Luke 7. This is a scene that takes place while he's in jail. And I think what can easily be understood as a wilderness experience in his own faith. Um, he's in jail. Things have not turned out the way that he thought they would. In many ways, Jesus's ministry has not turned out the way that he thought the Messiah, the Christ, was going to be operating in the world. And so here at the very end of his life, he's about to be executed. He sends two of his followers to travel to where Jesus is and to ask him, hey, are you really the one that we've been waiting for, that we as a people have been waiting for centuries? Or did we get it wrong? Are you a charlatan or just like a random person? Like, should we keep waiting for something from God to come? And Jesus, we didn't talk about Jesus's response much actually in our harbor meeting, but Jesus responds without giving a straight answer. So this is like the infuriating thing about Jesus, right? He's never giving a straight answer. He says, go back to John and just simply tell him what you're seeing and what you're hearing. I am healing people. I'm bringing new life to people. I'm preaching good news to the poor. So go tell John that, which is stuff John already knew. This is already what John knew that Jesus was doing, and it's what led to some of his questions. So, while it's an infuriating answer, I've always taken comfort in this because we have questions like this. Like, is this for real? Is any of this real? Like maybe like, is there a God? There's just all kinds of questions we have. And we don't get a straight answer. We don't get a straight answer when we pray about it. But we do have the same data that John had, which is that we have these stories of God. We have these stories of new life. We have stories of good news for the poor. So we're in a similar boat to John in some ways. Um, So we looked at like more of the passage though. So because I love the passage and it's kind of fascinating. So just in a brief summary, John's disciples go back to him. And Jesus, this was public. This was all happening in front of a crowd. Jesus could have said some negative words about John. Oh, John of little faith, whatever. And instead, he turns to the crowd and he affirms John and says that he was not only a prophet, he was more than a prophet. He's says he's the greatest person ever born, and yet every single person in God's family, in the beloved community, who gets to live with the belonging and the love and the acceptance of God and God's people, every single one of those people is greater than John, is experiencing something better than John as a more than prophet. So really cool conversation. And the whole thing is just fascinating. Okay, sorry. I'm like I can't stop myself. He like Jesus is like, "What did you go out to the wilderness?" Speaking of the wilderness, he's like, "You went out to the wilderness to see John. Why?" what were you out there to see? And at one point he says, were you out there to see like a rich person in like nice clothing, like who's like glorious and lovely and beautiful and has it all figured out? No, you go to the palace if you want to see that. But you instead went to the wilderness, the opposite of that, to see this weird dude eating locusts and honey and wearing camel's hair. Like that's what you signed up for. So it's a really cool conversation. Um, anyway, at the end of it, he then critiques the people, the crowds, mostly the religious leaders, I think, in the crowd, and basically says, look, you rejected John when he came as this severe figure, disciplined, talking about repentance. And then you also rejected me when I came doing the opposite. I came into people's homes. I invited the religious leaders and the sex workers and the tax collectors and said, we all belong together. Let's build community together. And you rejected me too. So we can't, there's nothing we can do to make you happy. And so one of the things we talked about, in addition to talking about doubt at our harbor meeting, we also talked about feelings and being moved, because I think this critique is basically saying like, whether you hear a joyous wedding song, you refuse to laugh and dance. If you hear a dirge, like a funeral song, you refuse to cry and weep and mourn. So like you just won't be moved by anything God sends your way. And so I think that was an invitation for us to reflect on how are we responding? What are we feeling in response to the things happening in our lives and happening around us? So yeah, so doubts, or I think doubt was kind of the main topic that we looked at in light of this story. A big theme of wilderness experiences is doubt. And then also we talked about feeling and feeling our feelings. And so yeah, that was a little bit of the content from our last harbor meeting.
Thanks, Jon. Jon and I have been joking in preparation for last night that Jon was like, there's so much here. I need more time. And it's been funny to, yeah, as many of us do, nerd out on Jon the baptizer, as you referred to him, and how as academics often refer to him. It was really rich and great to be thinking of his story in that way, and a lot of new insights for many of us. So we break out into discussion groups every Thursday night. What were some insights from your discussion group that came up while you were talking?
Yeah, some of the more specific, poignant moments were a bit personal, so they don't necessarily lend themselves to repeating here on the YouTube channel. But I'll say one big takeaway that I heard from a couple folks in the room, and then something that I said that I think is helpful too, thinking about Harbor and our history. But a couple people said, you know, one of the big things that has happened in my faith journey, that is still happening in my faith journey, is just learning to accept the doubts that I have. It's not about trying to overcome them, to destroy them, to hide them, to remove them. It's about just integrating them into my journey in my life. It's like accepting them for what they are and living with them. And I thought that was a good insight. And something along those lines that I said is like, I can remember the early days of Harbor, both like 3.5 years ago in person, and then when we first started meeting on Zoom. And I remember when the topic of doubts came up, there was very much a sense among many of us of like, I have a doubt. I have some doubts about some things. It was like this secretive, we still, I think, didn't feel like we had full permission, because we weren't used to having permission to voice our doubts. And now, I was joking, like, now fast forward 3 years and people at Harbor are just like, do I believe anything? I don't know. Maybe it's just all doubts all the time. Um, so it's funny, we're all on a journey, but I was trying to just say, like, it's okay wherever you land, wherever you are right now, in terms of how you relate to your own doubts, how you feel about them, how you process them. We're all in very different places, and there's no right, there's no wrong. Like, but we do want to have permission in this community to ask our questions and to voice our thoughts and our doubts. So I'm curious to hear what came up in your discussion room.
Yeah, that's great. We similar shared some personal stories that won't be repeated. But a theme that came up was, when we have our doubts, do we have capacity to actually ask these questions, not knowing how they'll be answered? And so that was part of a wrestling, is like, when do I have capacity to ask this question? And in some of our stories, the wounds have felt very deep because we've asked a question and it has been met with a community that's saying, do not ask that question. That is too much. You gotta get that away from here, get it out of here. And so it was interesting to wrestle with, yeah, these questions are really good. And also like our own like spirits, our own bodies also have to be honest about what we have capacity for. And we don't have to ask these intense doubting questions constantly, but when we do, how do we do it well and faithfully and honestly and open to the results that might happen? Uh, yeah, so we talked about that. We also referenced last night, we had a share, usually on Thursday nights, someone in our community shares a little bit about themselves. And this person, yeah, he really did a great job sharing about how his faith used to look like a couple of years ago, being angry at things about past I don't know, communities or religious experiences or ways that certain people are responding to things in the world, and kind of getting fired up and angry about that. And he's like, yeah, that's kind of a thing I'm maturing out of, and aging out of. And he shared with us how he's moving to a more of a reimagining faith, being more curious and happy. Those were words that he shared that I think resonated with a lot of us in the community. He's like, I'm curious and happy, and I'm trying to do that in my life and my faith, be curious and happy. And so we talked about how our doubts and what we're doing in our faith is not just being angry and fired up about things that we don't like, but actually shifting to a position more of reimagining our faith, being curious and happy, exploring what's next, and letting those doubts, although they can be very disorienting and scary, funnel into more possibilities instead of anger and I guess like closure is what I'm thinking of. So yeah, it was a great conversation. So many doubts though, of course. All of us will have doubts and questions, I'm sure, for a very long time.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, I'm glad to hear that it went well in our discussion rooms.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Jon. Uh, it was great learning more about the other John in the Bible.
Yeah, well, that's the fun thing too when you're in a discussion room and we're talking about John the Baptist. Everyone's like, John this, John that, then John does this, and I'm just like, I think they're talking about the baptizer. I don't think it's me. But yeah, it's confusing sometimes.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny. Well, thanks so much.
Thanks, Dottie. Good to talk to you.